My name's Sarah Martin. I'm one of the directors of NQHR, which is an HR consultancy, and it's a subsidiary of VWV, the law firm. As I said, thank you very much for joining us today for this session. Also presenting today is my colleague, Sue Meehan Boys, who is also an HR consultant at NQHR. Before we kick off, I just wanted to let you know that our next HR Club, these are quarterly events, free quarterly events, is going to be on the 25th of September, and that's going to be on conducting workplace investigations. I've already just mentioned how we're going to use Slido today. Please also feel free to use the chat box if you've got any questions, queries that crop up during the session, and we can keep an eye on that for you. We've tried to leave a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. So if you pop anything into that chat as we go through the session, we can pick that up. And there'll also be an opportunity to add other things in there once we get to that point. We try to make these sessions as interactive as possible, appreciating the confines of it being a webinar, hence the use of Slido. And join in and contribute on the chat function whenever that feels most appropriate for you. After the session, as Tamar said, we will send you a copy of the slides and a recording as well. I have got some notes that I will refer to from time to time. I just want to make sure that I cover everything as we go through. Right. So we're talking about managing difficult conversations today, and it's kind of a perennial issue that I'm sure all of you on the call will have come up against, and it's something that we come up across a lot in the context of the work that we do as HR consultants. So we weren't altogether surprised when we had 150 of you sign up to attend this event this morning, and it kind of reflects our experience of what we see in practice. I speak to lots of organisations that have challenges with their employees and want some support in working through those. And often when you drill down into the issue, it can be that somewhere along the line there's been an issue that's bubbled up, and it hasn't been tackled at an early stage. And often the reason for that is because it involves having some sort of difficult interaction with a colleague, an employee, and that hasn't happened. And there are often lots of reasons why that might not have happened, but it's something we see a lot of. So what we're going to talk about today is broadening our understanding of why it is these conversations can be challenging. Why are they avoided? We frame the session very much from the context of how you can support your line managers to tackle these difficult conversations. So we're looking at this topic in the context of what you will probably see in your roles, and hoping to equip you with some skills and tips and tricks for how you can help to support your line managers. We're going to think a little bit about the business implications of when these conversations are avoided. And we're going to also look at some really practical things that you can do to help support your line managers. I think it's important to reference is that we're focusing on difficult conversations and the skills around having those. But at various points during the session today, we'll be advocating for a sort of a bit of a shift in mindset, a bit of a think around, instead of framing it as how to have a difficult conversation and getting into that as a sort of standalone issue, I suppose, also thinking about a bit of a culture shift of how we can develop ways of continuous conversation and a sort of growth focused mindset, as that being our kind of way of operating in our day-to-day business interactions with staff, which kind of then sets the framework and the ethos and a practice of making these conversations part of the norm of how we go about things day to day. What I wanted to start with is a couple of questions just to get a sense around the room, the virtual room. So I'd like you to use your Slido now to answer this question. Do you think in your organisation your managers avoid difficult conversations with employees or colleagues? 89% of you think that they do, and that probably is one of the reasons why you decided to come along to our session today. I don't personally find that surprising. We get lots of requests for training in this area. It's something that comes up a lot. How does that compare to some statistics from a survey conducted by the CMI, which is the Chartered Management Institute? A survey they did found that 57% of respondents who answered would do almost anything to avoid a difficult conversation, and 52% said that they would rather put up with a negative situation at work than have to talk about it. That survey also found that 2/3 of the 2,000 workers who were surveyed said that they felt stressed or anxious if they knew they had to have a difficult conversation. So our figures on the call today are 88% of you think that your managers avoid having difficult conversations with employees or colleagues. The next question, to start deep diving into that a little bit more, why do you think they avoid those conversations? This is a word cloud question. It's a free text, so feel free to just type in there a couple of words as to why you think they're being avoided, and we can see if there's any themes that come out. Oh, kicking the can down the road, embarrassment, nerves, lack of confidence coming through loud and clear, hard work, inexperienced. Yeah, not wanting to be the bad guy. Absolutely, all of those things and more. But absolutely, some are using slightly different phraseology here, but some of the themes are really similar. It's too uncomfortable, lack of experience, fear, think someone else's problem. Yeah, easier not to. Some of the things that we to add into that is, some people are friends with their work colleagues, and that makes for a really difficult dynamic if you then have to try and separate that personal from the professional and have a difficult conversation. Yeah, don't want to be the bad guy. Some people don't want to be disliked. They want people to think they're nice and approachable and friendly. And the idea of changing that view is really difficult. Will they make the situation worse rather than better? Getting really sort of caught up in the moment and not knowing what to say, and it becoming really awkward is another reason. And fear of the unknown, not knowing what's going to come out from that person when you sit down and have that conversation, not wanting that conflict, all really good things and things that I would expect to see on that screen. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sue now. He's going to unpick this a little bit more. So I'll just move on the slide and hand over to Sue.
Thanks, Sarah. Morning, everyone. So we just wanted to look a little bit further into why do we, as I suspect many of us would all recognise some of those emotions that were on the word cloud. Why do we find them so challenging? Putting off tough conversations is a natural reaction. We're hardwired as humans to avoid conflict. It feels emotionally risky. And as I think some of you've put down, there's this concern about saying the wrong thing, hurting someone's feelings, or even creating more tension in a situation. And it's true, I think many of us will have met managers who just want everyone to like them. And then if you look at it from an employer's point of view, we're concerned that they can become defensive or disengaged, which then makes those conversations feel like minefields. So without the right skills, managers can rush through those conversations or perhaps even sugarcoat the message, and ultimately missing that opportunity for a meaningful discussion. And what we've put on the slide here is some sort of the sort of themes around that. And I'm just going to refer back to the CMI survey that Sarah referenced, around this aspect of fear of conflict or retaliation. I think in that survey, 43% of those surveyed said they feared not knowing how the other person would respond, and 29% were afraid of being put in a confrontational position. And certainly people do worry about their relationships, about damaging them or being perceived negatively. And I guess for some people, it can be the concern that it might have an impact on their career if they're the person that speaks out or seems to be challenging something. Emotional discomfort, 29% of those interviewed surveyed, worried about getting upset or emotional. When you're dealing with a tough topic, it can often trigger anxiety, guilt, or even defensiveness, which can make it hard to stay calm and constructive in that conversation. And let's be honest, avoidance feels like the path of least resistance, especially in team environments. And perhaps where managers have had bad outcomes from previous attempts, then they're going to be more concerned, more anxious, and more hesitant. And it's this prioritization of wanting to be light, be approachable, which can lead to conflict avoidance. And I think one of the biggest aspects on the word cloud was this question of skills or confidence. And certainly that was reflected in the survey. We saw 31% were concerned about not being able to get a point across clearly. And actually 80%, so it certainly feels like it's aligning with what you have all put in today, said that they'd had no formal training on how to handle difficult conversations. And many of those conversations just don't happen because where we've not been taught how to navigate them effectively. And when you don't know how to start that conversation, you get into procrastination mode, and actually the point is missed. The person doesn't know that actually there's an issue at hand and you've missed an opportunity. Which sort of leads on to this aspect of unclear purpose. And having worked in HR for a long time, and I'm sure many of you will have experienced this in your roles, perhaps maybe coming into a role where a senior manager has said to you, this person's a problem, there's an issue to deal with, you need to get on with it and deal with it. But sometimes they fail to give you that level of detail or clarity, but you're just expected to pick up on it. And it can be that lack of clarity that can be really undermining in terms of a manager approaching a conversation. Similarly, the fear of that conversation almost means that there's this head in the sand moment. Managers would avoid planning it in any way because they just know it's going to be uncomfortable. But as we will all probably know, and again, the reason why you're all here today, the reality is if you're unclear about what the issue is, or indeed if you don't even have facts and you make some very general statements, the conversation just feels random. It can even feel to the person on the receiving end like it's a personal attack. And you create that confrontation, which is so feared. Whereas actually, if it's handled correctly, you can come out with a very objective discussion, which is solution focused rather than criticizing. And we mentioned also this aspect of the kind of context of your organization. What's the norm in terms of conversations? And going back to what Sarah was saying, if your workplace tends to avoid welcoming direct feedback or open dialogue, then the people who work there will follow suit. If your culture doesn't back those candid conversations or provide training to have them, then your managers are likely to feel unsupported. And it can also impact if the conversation is with someone who's more senior, perhaps. or perhaps has a more powerful voice. Because if you don't feel that you're going to be backed up by the business, you might worry about whether or not that conversation is going to land, or whether you're going to be backed up, and how ultimately it could affect your position. Next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So we talked about the business impact, because this is really critical. In a 23 Gallup survey of employee engagement, they found that a manager having one meaningful conversation per week with each team member develops high performance relationships more than any other leadership activity, which is quite interesting to hear, because you'd assume there would be far more strategic activities that would lead to that. Now, they've used the term meaningful conversations, which of course can cut across the spectrum of activities, but it would include those discussions on collaboration, goals, priorities, recognition, and employee strengths. So it definitely comes into the space of dealing with feedback and potentially difficult conversations. Similarly, authors of Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High, mentioned that when conversations turn crucial, managers either step up and handle them well, or they don't. And that decision can determine the outcome of the relationship, the team, or indeed an organisation. So it's easy to kind of make those sweeping statements, but let's kind of consider more specifically what that might look like. So in our beautiful diagram here, we've kind of put out some ideas of things that could be the business impact. So stunted growth, for example, reluctance to address any performance issues, behavioural concerns, or opportunities for skills development can lead to a lack of constructive feedback, which ultimately will stunt individual growth and then by default team and organisation growth. Eroded trust is quite an interesting one, because again, this might be a very familiar feeling for you in your roles, but when challenging conversations are sidestepped, it can foster an environment of suspicion and secrecy, and people don't feel that they're being listened to or that they're being supported. And leading researchers in this area, such as Brené Brown and Amy Edmondson, highlight that vulnerability and psychological safety are pillars for building trust. So it's really important that that's reflected in the actions of the business and the managers within it. We've put up here to suppress creativity, and in some 2022 research by Kingston University, Sam Smith found that creativity and innovation thrive in environments where team members openly collaborate and exchange ideas, and by default have the opportunity to challenge each other. Excuse me. The consequences of avoiding that challenging conversation in leadership can be as simple as an organisation's next $1 million deal never being brought to the table because a team member didn't feel like they would be heard or supported. And they put forward an interesting example of when the consequences of that lack of opportunity for challenging conversations can have dire implications. And the example they've used is the Challenger launch in 1986. And 2 weeks before it was launched, it had been certified as ready for flight readiness. But of course, weather is a difficult beast and could not be anticipated. But the day before the launch, NASA personnel became concerned about the weather, and they were asked to review the safety of the flight in light of that potential cold weather. There was, as I'm sure you'll all experienced in similar situations, lots of conversations, teleconferences taking place with earnest conversations happening, with the ultimate result that the engineers actually recommended against a launch in those low temperatures. But what actually happened was that was not brought further into the management discussion. And in fact, that recommendation in a separate secret offline, a conversation was ignored, and as a consequence, it launched and, as we know, was destroyed 73 seconds later. So that's obviously a very extreme example, but it's useful to consider how just by not creating the opportunity for that conversation to challenge openly and to bring that to the table could have an implication in a business. And some of the strategies to avoid that suppressed innovation can be an opportunity to set out how we work agreements amongst teams, to say, actually, to give people the permission that if they're not seeing something that others are seeing, will you share it with me and will you create discussion? If you have a feeling, if you aren't aligned or have specific concerns about work we're doing on, how do I share that with you? And how do we know that we've all got each other's backs? And that can feel like quite a contrived agreement, but actually, if you give people permission to have those conversations, it can create more of that meaningful dialogue between teams, which just then pervades into their everyday working. It doesn't always have to be about challenging conversations. We probably all know that where there are challenging issues, productivity can be impacted, and whether that's the individual or the team, it can have quite significant implications. It could lead indeed to the absence of the individual, but also others may by default act in a different way if they feel that matters aren't being dealt with. And ultimately, managers risk losing respect from colleagues and teams if they see something not being dealt with. And that can also impact, as we've listed here, about the impact on employee morale and engagement. It can create tensions for teams and ill feeling if you feel that somebody's getting away with something. It can just create a concern with employees that they lose faith with the organisation, and could even result in people making the decision to exit an organisation. There's also this question of being able to impose a sanction at a later date. Again, as we all know, avoiding an issue almost never ends up in it going away. It just worsens. And of course, it gets to the point where it's really hard to deal with. And one of those aspects is that if you've not acted previously to correct behaviour there or highlight a concern, it can be more difficult to enforce that corrective action later on. And then there's this duty of care that we have to our employees to make sure that in dealing with issues that aren't working or concerns that are being raised, if we're failing to do that, you're failing in your responsibility and duty of care to protect staff, whether it's the individual themselves, the teams around them, etc. Next slide. Oh. Such a good slow. We want to leave it on there for a bit.
It's not moving. There we go. There we go.
Thank you. So thinking about the business impact, particularly the line manager role and what may be happening for them, we thought it would be useful to take a look at some researchers in this area. And one of them is Brené Brown, who's an American academic and podcaster that I'm sure many of you have heard of. But one of the things that Brené says is that basically feeding people half-truths which is designed just basically to make them feel better, which is actually almost always about making ourselves feel better and more comfortable, is actually unkind. She says that not getting clear with a colleague about your expectations because it feels too hard, yet holding them accountable or blaming them for not delivering is unkind. So talking about people rather than to them is also unkind. So it's a really clear message in that space that what we think is kind is actually not, and is often going to be counterproductive. And then the next slide also shows some further research by Hacking HR, which talks about the importance of kind leadership. And puts forward some attributes that it says are key for kind leaders. And the point they're making is that actually kindness in leadership is often misunderstood, undervalued, or outright confused with being soft and weak, and shouldn't be underestimated. Now, what I won't do in the interest of time, I won't read the slide through, but you'll see the detail when it comes through. But ultimately, they've identified 7 areas where actually you can still be a kind manager, holding people to account, but doing it with compassion, involving people in that process of decision making, but ensuring they're clear about the role that they have, and ensuring you're actively listening to them and communicating clearly. But ultimately, a kind leader is someone who's got the best long-term interests and the health of the organisation in mind, but they choose to have kindness and clarity over just being nice. And I think it's that mix of the words being used interchangeably that perhaps has given kind leadership its bad name. Shall we move on, Sarah? So let's talk more specifically about what can you do to support your managers with these conversations, because ultimately, again, in the roles that you all have, I suspect you will have many people coming to see you, phoning you up saying, I've got this tricky situation and I don't know what to do about it, or worse still, can you sort it, which is always the slight nervousness of an HR professional. But there are some really simple ways in which you can manage that with those individuals. The first one is the obvious one, but perhaps is the one that seems to be forgotten about, because as we've seen in the research and perhaps what you've all put forward, people don't feel they have the tools or the training. And it's as simple as things like workshops or conversation frameworks. And Sarah mentioned we do a lot of training in this area, and it is one of the training sessions that is the most popular, I think, because people feel really concerned about what it is they can do. The people find them a source of anxiety and recognize that they need the skills to do the training that they do. So if you're offering opportunities for people to skill themselves up and to have an opportunity to practice in that session, you'll be providing them with the tools that they can then go out and actually have an attempt to have a deal with that difficult conversation. The next point is about normalizing them. And again, we've used normalize difficult conversations, but it is absolutely about creating an open dialogue of conversation within the organisation that's both around constructive conversations as well as the ones that perhaps are more tricky. But again, if people have that feeling that the organisation values this process, then it will become far more embedded in the way that managers approach trickier situations. Providing your managers with opportunities to practice is almost the obvious one again, but perhaps something that we shy away from. I think again at our training sessions, we quite often have people slightly nervously when we say we're going to do a bit of role play, but it's it's not the activities in front of a lot of people, which I think is what most people hate, but the opportunity to sit with someone and say, can I just talk through the script that I've put together for this session, tell me what you think, any feedback. Actually, that's a really powerful tool for those managers to go through the process, because then they can start to recognize what they feel when they're having that conversation, if they do have any anxiety or a tendency to bluster through. And you can observe the messaging that they're giving out and perhaps potentially avoid those conversations taking the negative turn, which sometimes can happen if managers are left to go free flow on them. Providing practical tips and the sort of strategies for it is an obvious one again, but encouraging your managers not to just wing it, but to actually go through some process of preparation is key, because without that planning, without the facts, without clarity of the message they're giving, the conversation is going to be wasted at best, and at worst create some further conflict. in ensuring that people understand that actually the conversations can sometimes go the wrong way. They won't all go to plan, but it's practice that makes perfect. But also, what worked in one situation won't always work in another. And recognizing how they conduct those conversations. Do they have a tendency to interrupt? Do they make assumptions about the individual before they've even started? Have they already thought through the outcome without really actively listening to the individual to hear what they've been telling them? So all of those aspects of people just giving some consideration as to how they plan and prepare for it is really important. And I think you can really support the managers in doing that. And then that final point about reinforcing accountability, I kind of referred to at the beginning, but many of us, I'm sure, will have been in the situation of being in a meeting where you've been asked to come along with a line manager who then just turns and says, and so from HR has got something to tell you. And that's a really horrible position to be in, because actually, if you're not the line manager of an individual, it can feel really unfair to be, one, put in that position, but also for the individual to hear a message from you. So your role is absolutely not to take over or to be made to take over the conversation, but to support those managers in having the conversation and hold them to account for having them well once you've given them the skills. So I will hand back over to Sarah now for the next part of the session.
Thank you, Sue. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about how one of those conversations might be structured. And this is something that you could use or something that you can share with your managers if they need a little bit of guidance, the sort of practical tips in terms of having that conversation. As Sue said, this really is an area where practice makes perfect. Not all conversations are going to go brilliantly, and I think there's a bit of context setting for a manager in that sense, because it can feel really upsetting if you have that conversation and it doesn't go well, but equally really great if you have that conversation and you come out the other side of it feeling like you've really made some progress. Given what I'm saying about practicing, there are some really easy ways to do that. As Sue said, we do a training session where we do some role play activities with delegates, and that always goes really well. There are some AI options out there. There are some really clever sites that you can use where there is an AI bot who responds as you talk to it, and it plays out the difficult conversation, and then gives you a sort of summary of what you did well and what you could have done better. So that's an option too. But okay, let's think about going into this conversation. Always a good idea for a manager to set aside a time to have that conversation. This is not a scenario where catching someone in the kitchen or say, can I just have a quick word, is the best way to do it. You want to set aside a time to have the conversation. You want to have an appropriate environment in which it should take place. And you will want to give that individual a little bit of notice that you want to meet with them and a little bit of information about what it will be about. But then once you've set up that meeting, don't leave that individual hanging. Don't say, right, when I get back from holiday in 2 weeks' time, I want to talk to you about X, Y, Z. You will want to hold that meeting quite soon after you've given them notice that it's going to take place, and you've given them a little bit of information about what it is you want to talk about. You can guarantee, humans being what they are, if you don't give any information about what it might be about, then we will all fill in the gaps with all of our worst fears and worries. And that can create a really horrible situation for somebody. So you will want managers to prepare, and that doesn't mean writing a word for word script of what they're going to say, but bullet pointing it out is a really good idea. And being clear on the specifics. What is it? Do you need to check back through some Teams messages or some emails just to be clear on what the facts are? Why do you want to do that? Well, you want to do that because, in fact, I listened to a podcast just in the last day or so. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Dr. Chris and Dr. Zand Van Tulleken, who do, for those of you with kids, you might know them from Operation Ouch, or for the work that Dr. Chris Van Tulleken does, ultra processed people. But they have a podcast called What's Up Docs, and they've recently done an episode on difficult conversations. And I would recommend giving that a listen. But one of the things that was talked about on there is that when we're in situations of anxiety or stress, our prefrontal cortex, which is our sort of, a sound reasoning, calm section of our brain that regulates our emotions, it kind of starts to shut down a little bit. And for that reason, it's really good if a manager has a bit of a script, well, not a script, a bit of some bullet points to guide them through the conversation and to set down what they want to say. Taking control of the discussion is really important. It can help, I think, for managers to have a couple of conversation starters that they can use. Thanks for taking the time. There's something I'd like to talk through with you, or I'd like to talk to you about this issue because it's really important for us to get it right. I've got a little sidebar here. Some of you, I'm sure, will have heard about the concept of the feedback sandwich, which is when you say something positive at the beginning of a conversation, you put the negative bit in the middle, and then you end on a positive note. And that was often the way that people would talk in terms of having difficult conversations, but that has fallen out of favour a little bit because it can feel a little bit contrived and insincere. And there's a risk in doing that, that the difficult bit of the message can get lost. It's not wrong. And there are some circumstances where it might be the right thing to do. If genuinely somebody's involved in a big project and is doing an absolutely brilliant job over here, but there is this bit over here that you just need to deal with. But current thinking is that clear and direct feedback is delivered in a kind way is the best way to go. Set out the issue, give clear examples. This is our Brené Brown. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And then you listen. And that listening means no interruptions. What's that person's perspective? Open questions. What's your take on this? And really listen to what you're being told. And then the next part is that sort of, okay, we've got all this information out there. What's the way forward? And that's the bit where you hope that a manager can work collaboratively with a colleague or member of their team to come up with a solution. Now, I'm quite a big fan of the circle back. So, a manager won't always have the answers. It's fine if they say, look, I just need to take this away and reflect, and can we come back and talk about this again tomorrow? You've given me some information that I just need to go away and think about. Summarize where you've got to, and then follow up. As HR professionals, as you can imagine, we very much like to have a follow-up documented by email or some way, so that if you need to, you can refer back to what you've done and what's been agreed, because people forget, and that's they move on to the next thing, and then it's all kind of lost in the mist of time. So what we're going to do now, just to sort of get this into practice a little bit, is we've got a case study for you to look at. And I'd like you to spend just 2 or 3 minutes looking through this. It feels like a scenario that you've probably all seen and come across in your careers. And then we're going to just break that down and think about how you might support your manager to have the conversation. I'll let you just read that, and at 9:51 we'll come back on and talk about it. Okay, thank you. So let's run through how the steps that you might take to support Kathy in this situation. The first is you have this is a classic scenario that could, if left unchecked, grow arms and legs and become really difficult to deal with further down the line. So it is one where you would want to be saying to her, look, Kathy, you do need to have a conversation with James about this. You can't ignore this. You need to have an honest conversation, see what's going on. That's part of what we need you to do as a manager. If she is anxious about doing that, and is pushing back, then you'll want to understand what's behind that. Has she got some knowledge about this individual that might be causing her to worry about how he might react? Has she perhaps made some assumptions about what's going on for him that are influencing how she's feeling? Has she had conversations in the past that have gone badly? So try and work that through a little bit, and then help plan the conversation, help structure those bullet points, think about how she's going to be clear in what she wants to say. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Think about what those possible reactions could be and how she might deal with those. And be really help her to articulate and be clear on, what do you need from that individual? Being clear around those expectations and the follow up with her to ensure she's followed up with him in an appropriate way, and chat through how it went. What went well, what didn't go quite so well, were there any curveballs? How did she deal with those? How have things been left? Are there any things that she's learned from that conversation that she could do better next time? There can be a period of some self-reflection, I'm sure, for her, but also some kind of guided reflections for you to work through. And I understand that, some these things can take time, but practice makes perfect, and you hope that time investment and that kind of thoughtful consideration of what's happened, how she's going to do it, and how it went will then be time well spent as time moves forward. We've got 6 minutes left of the session, and so we did want to allow some time for questions in the chat box, but would also really value your thoughts on what's been useful from this session. So I haven't got sight of the chat box, but if Tamar or Sue could perhaps have a look into the chat box. I can see some participants typing in the takeaways box, but if there's anything in the chat box that people would like to add, then or ask us whilst we're here for the next 5 minutes or so, please do feel free. Are there any questions coming through?
I can't see the questions, I'm afraid, Sarah, so I'm wondering if Tamar's able to show us any questions if they're in the chat box.
Sorry, Sue, I thought you you could see.
I can't see it. I'm so
No
sorry.
no worries at all. There's nothing in the chat box at the moment, and there's also the Q&A box, and I can't see anything. So if anyone has anything, please do add in there.
Thanks, Tamar.
I mean, if there's anything after the session that you think of that you want to ask about, please do feel free to get in touch. But I can see some answers going into the box here about what's been useful from the session.
Someone's just asked, will the slides be recorded? The slides be shared? And
Will.
yes, they will, along with the recording as well.
Kindness, conversation, and clear coming out. That's really good. Okay. Right. As I said before, we would really like to make sure that the content that we deliver to you is useful. And so it would be really good to know what your sort of top two people challenges are that you face or that you are being asked to help resolve in your organization. Sickness, absence, that comes up a lot. Addressing wellness capability. Yeah, okay. Okay. It's really valuable for us to know what the challenges you face are.
Quite a range, isn't it? It's quite
Quite a
interesting to
range.
see. But equally familiar territory, I think, as well.
Absolutely. Okay. And sort of moving on from that, it would be really useful to think about what are the skills or knowledge gaps that you feel would help to overcome those challenges, because training and awareness raising is one thing. What do you think are the things that make it difficult to overcome those challenges? Is it embedding that learning? Is it a culture issue? Is it managers living your values and really role modeling those behaviors? Is it money? What are the things that you think stand in the way in your roles of you being able to really drill down and tackle those issues?
Time definitely is an issue, isn't it?
It really can be. I mean, I suppose for those on the call seeing all this, I mean, what this says to me is you're all going through the same thing. Too much to do, not enough time. You're all in similar territory. That's
Yeah.
interesting. So we'll review these the outcome of these after the session today, and we'll see if we can pull together some of the outcomes of this to share with you all, because I think it's useful, reassuring, if nothing else, to know that you're in a similar space, and we can also think about how we can tailor some of our sessions and the resources that we have to think about how we might help you to address some of those issues. But I'm conscious it's 10:01. Thank you very, very much for joining us and taking the time this morning. I hope you found some useful information to come out of the session, and hope to see you again at our next HR Club. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.